Pennsylvania is not California, and it is not Texas, and it is not any of the states in this series where the motorcycle made an obvious kind of sense. You look at a map of Pennsylvania and you understand immediately why the motorcycle culture here was different. The state is bisected by mountain ridges running northeast to southwest, the Appalachians, the Alleghenies, the ridge and valley topography that made building anything across the state a feat of engineering that took generations. The Pennsylvania Turnpike, when it opened in 1940, was called the Tunnel Highway because it went through 7 mountains rather than around them. Blue Mountain, Kittatinny, Tuscarora, Sidling Hill, Rays Hill, Allegheny Mountain, Laurel Hill. 7 tunnels cut through 7 ridges because there was no other way through. What that geography produced for motorcycle riders in the 1970s was this: road quality that varied from genuinely excellent to genuinely dangerous within the same 10-mile stretch, whether that could change from clear to ice in 30 minutes at elevation, distances between towns that meant a breakdown was a genuine problem rather than an inconvenience, and road surfaces in the coal country that were actively damaged by the weight of coal trucks running the same routes every day for 50 years. But it also produced this: Route 6 across the northern tier, 240 miles from Irvine to Clark Summit, through the Pocono Mountains, through farmland and forest, and the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon at Pine Creek Gorge, the kind of road that makes a rider understand why they started. Route 44 from Potter County south through the Allegheny National Forest, designated the Highway to the Stars because the light pollution is so low, you can see the Milky Way from the road on a clear night. The stars. The Laurel Highlands stretch on Route 711 and 381, 68 miles through mountain country near Ohio Pile, where Frank Lloyd Wright built falling water directly over a waterfall in 1935 because he said the site demanded it. And Route 30, the Lincoln Highway, Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, 294 miles. The first transcontinental highway in America opened in 1913, following a British military trail built by General Forbes in 1758 during the French and Indian War. In Pennsylvania, it followed the old Lancaster Pike, the first paved road in America, completed in 1796, through Lancaster and Gettysburg and Chambersburg and the Laurel Highlands into Pittsburgh, every mile of it carrying 300 years of American movement. The Lancaster, a California rider, had beautiful roads and perfect weather. A Pennsylvania rider had Route 44 at night, under a sky full of stars after riding through a mountain rainstorm that soaked through everything, with 40 miles still to go, and a shovelhead that had been making a noise since Renovo that probably wasn't serious but definitely needed attention when he got home. The California rider had the better afternoon. The Pennsylvania rider had the better story. To understand the motorcycle culture of the 1970s, Pennsylvania, you have to understand what was happening economically in that specific decade. Because the 1970s were the last good years, and the people living in them mostly didn't know that yet. In 1973, the United Steelworkers Union and the major steel producers negotiated what historians have called the most generous labor contract in American history. American steelworkers became among the highest paid industrial workers on the planet. A man working a furnace in the Mon Valley or on the floor at Bethlehem Steel in the Lehigh Valley was earning wages that put him solidly in the American middle class. He owned his house. He was paying into a pension. His kids were going to college. And he had a Saturday. Bethlehem Steel, headquartered in Bethlehem in the Lehigh Valley, was the number 2 steel producer in the nation. At its peak, it employed generations of the same families, fathers and sons and grandsons, who learned the same processes in the same buildings. The blast furnaces along the Lehigh River ran continuously. The company had built 80% of New York's skyscrapers, the Ben Franklin Bridge, the George Washington Bridge, the Golden Gate. Bethlehem Steel was in the bones of American infrastructure. Pittsburgh's Mon Valley was the other anchor. The Homestead Works, the Clairton Coke Works, Carnegie Steel, Jones and Laughlin, U.S. Steel, the mills running along the Monongahela River for miles, the valley glowing orange at night, the smell of coke and sulfur in the air year-round. In the peak years of the early 1970s, these mills employed over 150,000 workers in and around Pittsburgh alone. Entire communities existed because of the mills. Homestead's 8th Avenue shopping district, the the bars in Clairton and McKeesport and Duquesne that opened at 6 a.m. for the workers coming off the night shift. And then there was Coal, the anthracite region in the northeast, Temecula, Hazleton, Scranton, Pottsville, Mahanoy City, towns strung along Route 309 through the coal region like beads on a wire, and the bituminous coal country in the west. The 1973 oil crisis made coal suddenly valuable again. The mines were running. The miners were working. The Pioneer Tunnel in Ashland, where you can still ride the Loki locomotive into the mine today, was part of an industry that was, for that specific window in the early 1970s, economically viable in a way it wouldn't be again. What all of that produced for motorcycle culture was a working-class man with disposable income, mechanical skills, and a specific relationship to machines that came directly from his work. A steelworker understood metal. He understood tolerances and heat, and the difference between a sound that was normal and a sound that meant something was about to fail. He understood maintenance schedules not as suggestions, but as survival protocols. He brought that understanding to his motorcycle, and it showed. The Pennsylvania rider of the Nowdies did not take his bike to a dealer. He did not call a shop for a quote. He bought a Chilton manual and a set of wrenches, and he figured it out in his garage on Saturday afternoon with a beer and a radio. Because that is what you did when you understood machines. Because that is what you did when the nearest dealer was in the next county. And because fixing something yourself in a state where the industrial culture demanded self-reliance was not a last resort. It was the first option. I personally think that relationship between industrial work and motorcycle maintenance produced a quality of rider that the California scene, for all its beauty and weather, never quite matched. The California rider had the resources and the roads. The Pennsylvania rider had the knowledge. Those are not the same thing. The self-reliance that defined Pennsylvania motorcycle culture in the mid-70s is the same self-reliance that the 2026 Motorcycle Buyer's Bible was built on. Independent data. No dealer relationships. No industry money influencing what I tell you. The OEM tire data, the gear certification breakdown, the pre-purchase inspection protocol, the dealer scripts, all of it built the way a Mon Valley steelworker would have approached it. Figure it out yourself. Use real information. Don't trust the man trying to sell you something. It launched at $97. Right now it is $9, link in the description. The National Motorcycle Press in the 1970s covered California. It covered Daytona. It covered Sturgis when Sturgis became large enough to ignore. It covered the custom chopper scene in Los Angeles and the racing scene at Laguna Seca. It covered the West Coast because the West Coast was photogenic and accessible, and because the editors and photographers were mostly in California to begin with. What it did not cover was Route 309 through the coal region on a November afternoon when the sky was the color of the inside of a mine and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in an hour, and the road through Tamaqua had a crack in it from the coal trucks that would put you down if you hit it at the wrong angle. It did not cover the Laurel Highlands run on a May morning before the tourists arrived, when you had the road through Ohiopyle entirely to yourself, except for the white water noise of the Youghiogheny River below. It did not cover the northern tier on Route 6 in October when the Pocono foliage was at its peak and the road was dry and the temperature was exactly right, and there were 300 miles in front of you through country so empty that you could go an hour without seeing another vehicle. Pennsylvania riders knew about these roads. They had been riding them for years. They did not need a magazine to tell them where to go because they lived there. They rode in the cold because the cold was 6 months of the year, and you either rode in it or you didn't ride. They rode on roads damaged by industry because all the roads were damaged by industry. They developed riding skills that warm weather riders in flat states simply never needed. The specific roads that defined Pennsylvania motorcycle culture in the 1970s: Route 6, the northern tier route from Irvine to Clark Summit, 240 miles through some of the most remote landscape in the northeastern United States. Through the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon, Pine Creek Gorge, where the valley drops 800 feet below the road and the gorge runs 47 miles through territory so undeveloped it was designated a National Natural Landmark. a road that rewards riders who understand patience and punishes riders who don't respect the elevation changes and the sudden weather. Route 44, the highway to the stars through Potter County. 44 miles from US Route 6 south through the Alleghenies with no traffic and no crossroads and curves that require your full attention. Cherry Springs State Park sits on this route, the darkest night sky in the eastern United States. No light pollution for 50 miles in any direction. A Pennsylvania rider in the 1970s knew this road the way California riders knew Pacific Coast Highway. With one difference. Nobody from the national press ever came to write about it. The Lincoln Highway. Route 30 from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. The first transcontinental highway. In the 1970s, it was already being bypassed by the interstates, which meant the old road through the Alleghenies, through Chambersburg, through Bedford, through the Laurel Highlands was less trafficked, slower, and more honest than the newer roads. A rider who took Route 30 from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh in 1975 was riding the same general alignment that Conestoga wagons had used to cross the Alleghenies 200 years before. That historical depth is not nothing. Pennsylvania roads carry American history in a way that California roads, for all their beauty, simply do not. Route 309 through the coal region. Allentown north through Tamaqua and Hazleton into the Wyoming Valley. The stretch through the anthracite towns is not pretty in the conventional sense. The landscape has been worked. The coal comb banks rise above the towns, those gray-black mounds of mine waste that define the skyline of every coal community for 100 years. The towns have the specific gravity of places built for a purpose that is slowly failing. But the road itself, in the mountains between the valley floors, is challenging and specific in a way that flat roads never are. And the riders who knew it were the riders who lived in those coal towns, who had been riding these roads since they were old enough to ride. To understand the outlaw motorcycle culture of the 1970s Pennsylvania, you have to understand one fact that separates the state from everywhere else in the Big Four story. The Hells Angels are from California, the Outlaws are from Chicago, the Bandidos are from Texas. All three expanded internationally, Europe, Australia, Canada, because the expansion model was always part of the strategy. The Pagans are from Pennsylvania, and they never left. Founded in 1959 by Lou Dobkin in Prince George's County, Maryland, the club grew quietly through the early 1960s. It was John Satan Moran, who had been president of the Sons of Satan MC out of central Pennsylvania before patching over, who transformed the Pagans into what they became. Under Moran's leadership in the late 1960s and through the 1970s, the Pagans grew to nearly 5,000 members. Not 500, not 1,500. 5,000 members, all concentrated on the East Coast between Maryland and New York, with Pennsylvania as the gravitational center. The Pagans became dominant in the mid-Atlantic region in a way no other club managed because they filled a specific vacuum. The Hells Angels were a West Coast organization expanding eastward. The Outlaws were a Midwest organization. Nobody owned the Mid-Atlantic. The Pagans did. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Delaware County, the industrial corridor between the two cities, the coal towns of the anthracite region, the club's leadership, the mother club, always exactly 13 members, always moving, never in a fixed location, was traditionally based in central Pennsylvania. Their patch is specific and worth understanding. The Norse fire giant Sir T.R. sitting on the sun, wielding a sword. The image came directly from Jack Kirby's illustration in Journey into Mystery, issue 97, a 1963 Marvel comic. Sir T.R. is the giant destined to set the world on fire at Ragnarok, the end of everything. The Pagans chose that image deliberately. The colors are red, white, and blue. The only Big Four club whose patch uses American colors. They do not wear a bottom rocker. Every other Big Four club identifies its geographic chapter on the back of the vest. The Pagans do not. The reason is territorial, the mother club moves, the chapters move, and the Pagans have never been a club that wanted law enforcement or rivals to know exactly where they were based at any given moment. The nomadic quality is built into the patch design. Members are required to ride only Harley-Davidson motorcycles with engines larger than 900 cc. Not British bikes, not Japanese bikes. Harleys. The industrial corridor of the East Coast ran on American iron in the 1970s, and the Pagans reflected that culture exactly. The Warlocks MC, founded in Philadelphia in 1967, controlled the Delaware Valley and provided the primary territorial competition the pagans faced in their home state. The Warlocks had been bolstered by returning Vietnam veterans the same way clubs across the country had been, men who came home from Southeast Asia and found that the brotherhood structure of a motorcycle club mapped onto the unit cohesion they had known overseas. By 1977, the two clubs were engaged in documented territorial conflict across South Jersey, Delaware County, and the Philadelphia corridor that produced federal indictments and set the pattern for East Coast outlaw motorcycle warfare through the next decade. The pagans in the 1970s were not a media story the way the Hells Angels were a media story. Hunter Thompson had written about the Angels. Hollywood had made films. The national consciousness had a picture of the California Outlaw Club that it simply did not have of the Pennsylvania one. The pagans operated in the industrial East in communities that the cultural press did not cover, in a decade when the national narrative about motorcycle culture was still being written from the West Coast perspective. The 5,000 working-class riders in blue denim vests riding Harleys through the coal towns and steel mill corridors of Pennsylvania were the most powerful outlaw motorcycle presence on the East Coast, and the national motorcycle press barely knew their names. That is the Pennsylvania story in miniature, the most significant thing happening in the room, and nobody from outside the room was paying attention. I want to be direct about something before we finish this story. The 1970s motorcycle culture Pennsylvania was built on a foundation that was already cracking by the time the decade ended. The United Steelworkers 1973 contract, the most generous in American history, was negotiated at almost exactly the moment that Japanese and German steel began taking market share that American mills would never recover. The coal towns were experiencing the second act of a decline that had started in the 1950s when anthracite heating lost the residential market to oil and gas. The good years of the early 1970s, when the mill money was coming in and a steelworker could afford a shovel head and had Saturdays to ride it, were being financed on borrowed time. By 1980, the mills began laying off in numbers that ended communities. Between 1980 and 1983, roughly 95,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in and around Pittsburgh alone. Homestead's 8th Avenue, the shopping district that had thrived on mill wages for decades, started to hollow out in the late 1970s and was mostly gone by 1985. The Homestead Works was demolished in 1991. The site became a shopping mall in 1999. The Clairton Coke Works is still running, one of the last remnants of what the valley was. Its furnace is still visible from the Mon Valley Road at night. Bethlehem Steel filed for bankruptcy in 2001 and was dissolved in 2003. The blast furnaces along the Lehigh River in Bethlehem now stand as a backdrop for an arts and entertainment district, Steel Stacks. There is a casino where the parking lot used to be. The 5 blast furnaces are preserved as monuments. You can look at them from the amphitheater where they hold concerts in the summer. I personally think there is something important to sit with in that image. The blast furnaces serve as a backdrop for an entertainment venue. The thing that made Bethlehem what it was, preserved as scenery for events held on the site where it used to exist. That is not criticism of what Bethlehem did with the space. It is recognition of what was lost and what the loss looked like. The motorcycle culture that came out of those mills and those coal towns was built by men who understood machines completely and trusted their own hands, who rode in November because the season was what it was, and if you waited for perfect weather in Pennsylvania, you didn't ride much, who fixed everything themselves because there was no other option and because the industrial culture they came from demanded self-sufficiency as a baseline condition, who built clubs in communities that the national press ignored, on roads that the national press never wrote about, with a presence on the East Coast that was larger and more organized than anything the West Coast press understood or acknowledged. The 1970s were their decade, the last full decade before the economic collapse began, the decade when the shovelhead and the coal money and the mountain roads were all happening at the same time, the pagans at 5,000 strong, the Warlocks building their Delaware Valley presence, 1,000 unnamed writers in the anthracite towns who never made a magazine, but knew Route 309 from Allentown to Hazleton, the way a carpenter knows the grain of wood he has been working for 30 years. A Pennsylvania rider in the 1970s was, in most cases, riding a Harley-Davidson shovelhead. The engine had been introduced in 1966, replacing the panhead, and by the early 1970s it was established as the working-class machine of the East Coast outlaw and independent riding culture. Not the panhead of Easy Rider, which was already becoming a collector's item. The shovelhead, the engine that demanded attention and rewarded knowledge. The shovelhead earned its name from the shape of the rocker covers. They look like the back of a coal shovel, which was not an accidental association in the communities where the bike was most popular. It ran hot. It leaked oil. It vibrated at highway speeds in ways that required periodic attention to every fastener on the machine. The primary chain needed adjustment. The points needed setting. The pushrod seals needed watching. A shovelhead that was properly maintained and correctly jetted for the elevation it ran at would start on the first or second kick and run all day. A shovelhead that wasn't properly maintained would remind you specifically and persistently that it wasn't. The Pennsylvania rider maintained his shovelhead. He had to. The nearest authorized dealer was far enough away that a breakdown on Route 44 in Potter County was a problem of a different order than a breakdown on Sunset Boulevard. There were no cell phones. There was no roadside assistance. There was a tool roll under the seat and the knowledge to use it, or there was a long cold walk to the nearest farmhouse to use a phone to call someone who would drive 2 hours to come get you. That reality shaped the culture. It selected for mechanical knowledge the way California's weather and roads selected for rider confidence. A Pennsylvania shovelhead rider in the 1970s could do a valve adjustment on the road, could diagnose an electrical fault from sound alone, could rejet a carburetor for altitude change because the difference between riding at 800 feet in the valley and 2,400 feet on the ridge was real, and the engine told you about it if you weren't paying attention. The British bikes were still present. The Triumph Bonneville, the BSA, the Norton Commando, among riders who preferred the lighter handling and the higher revving character. Vietnam veterans who had been exposed to military bikes sometimes gravitated toward the Triumph because the 500cc T100 had been standard US military equipment and they knew the machine. But by the mid-1970s, the British motorcycle industry was in its terminal collapse. The Triumph factory at Meriden went into receivership in 1973. BSA had already failed. Norton was surviving on fumes and reputation. For a working-class Pennsylvania rider in 1975, the choice had largely narrowed to Harley-Davidson or Japanese. And in the communities shaped by the Pagans' influence, the Japanese option carried social weight that made it a practical non-choice. You rode American iron in the coal country and the steel towns because the culture demanded it, and because the shovelhead, for all its demands, was a machine you could understand completely. It had no electronics to fail, no black boxes, no computerized systems that required proprietary diagnostic equipment. A shovelhead was mechanical all the way down, and in the industrial communities of Pennsylvania, mechanical all the way down was not a disadvantage. Pottsville, Schuylkill County. The anthracite coal capital of America in its prime. Home of Yuengling Brewery, founded in 1829, the oldest operating brewery in the United States, which survived Prohibition by making near beer and ice cream and waited out the federal government the same way the coal towns waited out everything, stubbornly, with no expectation that the outside world would be particularly helpful. In the 1970s, Yuengling was still primarily a regional beer, sold in the bars and restaurants of the coal towns by men who had been drinking it since before they were old enough to legally drink it. The lager was part of the landscape, the way the culm banks were part of the landscape. You did not need to explain it to anyone who lived within 50 miles. You only needed to explain it to outsiders, and outsiders didn't come to Pottsville much. Scranton. The Electric City. Named for its pioneering electric streetcar system, the first in the United States. By the 1970s, the anthracite economy that had built Scranton was in its second generation of decline, and the city was running on institutional momentum and the particular stubbornness of northeastern Pennsylvania. The Lackawanna coal mine in nearby Scranton, where you can still descend into a working mine today, gives you a physical understanding of what the work was. The darkness, the coal dust, the specific weight of being underground. A man who spent his working life in that darkness had a specific relationship with open sky and open road that you cannot fully understand without understanding what he was coming from. Jim Thorpe. named for the greatest athlete of the 20th century, buried there at the request of two Pennsylvania towns that merged and took his name in exchange for the right to keep his body when his widow agreed to the arrangement in 1954 over the objections of his family who wanted him buried in Oklahoma. Jim Thorpe never lived in the Lehigh Valley. He never expressed a wish to be buried there. His son spent decades trying to move his remains to Oklahoma, where the Sac and Fox Nation had planned a memorial. They never succeeded. Jim Thorpe's body is in the Lehigh Valley because two Pennsylvania towns needed a tourism anchor and were willing to fight for it legally. The story, the specific Pennsylvania quality of acquiring something useful by whatever means are available and holding on to it with absolute stubbornness, is embedded in the landscape the way coal is embedded in the landscape. The writers who came from Jim Thorpe, from the Lehigh Valley, from the Pocono Mountain towns, knew the terrain of their country in the specific way that people who have lived somewhere their whole lives know terrain. Not as geography, but as memory. That corner where the road goes left unexpectedly, but always has. That stretch where the frost heaves come up in March and disappear by May. That diner in Mauch Chunk, the old name for Jim Thorpe, which nobody who grew up there actually used, that opened at 5 in the morning and closed at 2 in the afternoon and had the best pie in Carbon County and no sign out front. That is the Pennsylvania motorcycle culture of the 1970s. It does not photograph easily. It does not reduce to a slogan or a single defining image. It is weight and knowledge and stubbornness and a shovelhead that starts on the second kick because you know exactly what it needs and you gave it that.